change, and I hope in the next few days American people can become engaged and perhaps our colleagues will see it differently. I thank the Chair and will yield the floor. Note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from Texas.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be set aside.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that I be given 20 minutes to speak.
Is there objection? Majority Leader.
Objection whatsoever to the senator speaking, but was my understanding that he was going to ask some consent agreements, and I understand he has great persuasive talents in speaking, but I am not going to be able to do that. I interrupted my schedule today, which I was happy to do at the convenience of the senator from Texas. So I will be back in 20 minutes, and you can ask your consents at that time. Is that okay?
Well, I'm happy to ask the consents at the outset, if that would be preferable.
That way, if you would do that, I'd really appreciate it. And you have my word. I will watch what I can. If I can't, I will read every word of it tonight.
And I am hopeful my remarks will be persuasive when you watch them.
My friend is always persuasive.
Without objection.
The first unanimous consent request that I would put forward, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate agree to the motion to proceed to H.J. Res. 59, that no debate, amendments, or motion to the resolution be in order, that any and all points of order be waived, that the resolution be read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table without any intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Yes, reserving the right to object. Mr. President, my friend gets right to the point, and I appreciate that. I understand the junior senator from Texas asked consent to pass the House-passed continuing resolution by consent without any amendments, and I understand that. As I said, he got right to the point. The House-passed resolution, as we know now, would defund the Obamacare. It would block not only the administration of the program, but all related benefits as well, and that's untoward. Second, it includes so-called debt prioritization language, or what has been called the Pay China First policy. This would leave us vulnerable to default on our obligations to everyone else besides bondholders and Social Security. Everyone from veterans to small businesses to federal employees, contractors to doctors, hospitals, and Medicare patients generally. So, Mr. President, the President would veto this continuing resolution, so it is not going to become law anyway, and I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, the second unanimous request that I would put forward, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate agree to the motion to proceed to H.J. Res. 59, that any and all points of order be waived, that during consideration of H.J. Res. 59, adoption of any amendments be subject to a 60 affirmative vote threshold, and that upon disposition of all amendments, the resolution be read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table without any intervening action or debate.
Mr. President.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object. Mr. President, I again understand the senator from Texas in his request, which would create a new 60-vote hurdle where the Senate rules do not require one at the present time. Mr. President, I really try to follow the Senate rules. Sometimes they are obnoxious, and I wish they were different, but I try my best in leading us in this difficult Senate sometimes to live up to all the rules as they exist. Senate rules set up a lot of hurdles. That's the way the precedents have been developed over the years, and I understand that. Sometimes senators like these, sometimes they don't. I'd guess that most would say that senators have enough 60-vote hurdles, that the Senate has enough of these really arbitrary hurdles as it is. We don't add even more barriers to getting things done. Mr. President, we should be careful about adding new barriers. The American people are really fed up. I mean, I travel the country, and it's rare that I go someplace that they don't say, what are you going to do to change the rules? They know what the rules are and how difficult they are. And I would bet the vast, vast majority of the senators, Democrats and Republicans, would like them changed. The problem is, Mr. President, we've tried that recently. We were able to make a little headway, but not a lot. So I think that most Americans would rather we work on ways to agree, to work together, rather than disagree. And I almost would bet, although I'm not a betting man, that most Americans would rather we avoid shutting down the government. Mr. President, I know the sincerity of the senator from Texas. I understand that. I disagree with him. I hope as sincerely as he disagrees with me. But I don't take away from his sincerity. But having said that, I am in a position now to object, and I must do that.
Objection is heard. Senator from Texas? No?
I've been asked to do a brief unanimous consent request.
I'm happy to yield.
I have only one consent request for a committee to meet during today's session. It has my approval and that of Senator McConnell. I'd ask consent that this request be agreed to and be printed in the record.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President,
Senator from Texas?
at this point, I now ask unanimous consent that I be allowed 20 minutes to speak.
Without objection.
Mr. President, these two unanimous consent requests have the virtue of being clarifying. Clarifying what this debate is that the Senate will face this week. And I'm going to suggest to you, Mr. President, the Senate has not faced a more important debate in the short time that you and I have both served in this institution. No American wants a government shutdown. I don't want a government shutdown. No one on this side of the aisle wants a government shutdown. The House of Representatives doesn't want a government shutdown. Mr. President, 5 minutes ago, the Senate could have acted to prevent a government shutdown. The request that I promulgated to the Majority Leader was to pass the continuing resolution that the House of Representatives passed, and if that had happened, there would be no government shutdown. A government shutdown would be taken off the table. The specter that you and I see on the television screen every day, the countdown clock that has started to appear, would disappear. But unfortunately, the Majority Leader chose to object. To object and to say no, he would rather risk a government shutdown than act to prevent it. Now why? Again, the Majority Leader was quite candid. Because he supports the law called Obamacare. And I would note a component of that also. One of the pieces that the House of Representatives passed was a law that has been called the Default Prevention Act. The President of the United States has been doing a fair amount of public speaking, raising the prospect of a default on our debt. And the House of Representatives acted boldly to include in their continuing resolution language that would say the United States will never, ever, ever default on its debt. That in the event the debt ceiling is not raised, we will always pay our debt first. Now, I suspect every member of this body has spoken publicly about the calamity that would come from a default on the debt. I think it is quite revealing that the Majority Leader explicitly referenced and objected to by name taking a default off the table. I think that's unfortunate. There is a tendency in this town towards brinksmanship, towards pointing to events that can cause instability and uncertainty and using them to try to get your way. I wish the Majority Leader had been willing to step forward and say, I agree, number one, that the government should be funded. We should not have a government shutdown. And number two, that we should never, ever, ever even discuss a default on the debt. Had the Majority Leader simply said, I consent, a default on the debt would have been taken permanently off the table. Now, why didn't he? We all know why he did not. Because the Majority Leader embraces Obamacare. I'm going to suggest to you, Mr. President, that this body, a little over 3 years ago, passed Obamacare. It passed it on a straight party line vote. And in the time since it's passed, America has learned that it's not working. Americans all over this country are suffering because of Obamacare. It is the single biggest job killer in America. Every day we're seeing more and more evidence that Obamacare is killing jobs, that it is hurting American workers who are struggling, that it is causing people to be forcibly put into part-time work 29 hours a week, that it is jacking up their health insurance premiums, and it's causing more and more people who are struggling to lose their health insurance altogether. Just today, the New York Times reported that because of Obamacare, quote, insurers are significantly limiting the choices of doctors and hospitals available to consumers. That's today in the newspaper. USA Today reported on a new, quote, family glitch that could cause up to 500,000 children to go without insurance coverage. A headline in the Washington Post today read, quote, 1 week away, Obamacare's small business insurance exchanges not all ready for launch. And even the labor unions that once championed Obamacare are now publicly decrying it as a threat to the 40-hour work week that is the backbone of the American middle class. That is in the words of organized labor. This law is hurting the American people, and it's why there is bipartisan consensus outside of Washington, D.C., that we need to step up and stop it. That would be the responsible thing for senators on both sides of the aisle to do, to say the same rules should apply to hardworking American families that apply to big corporations and that apply to members of Congress. We've seen the President unilaterally put in place exceptions for giant corporations and members of Congress. Mr. President, I would submit hardworking American families deserve that same exception. So I think it is unfortunate that the Majority Leader chose to object to continuing government, to preventing a shutdown, to taking a default off the table, but I do think it is clarifying to make clear, as the Majority Leader just did, that he is willing to risk a government shutdown. He is willing to force even a government shutdown in order to insist that Obamacare is funded. And, Mr. President, that leads to the second unanimous consent request that I put forward. A simple request that every amendment on this continuing resolution be subject to 60 votes. Now, Mr. President, everyone in this body knows that is not an unusual request in the United States Senate. Amendments in this body are routinely subjected to 60-vote thresholds. Indeed, you and I will both recall just a few months ago when this body was debating the issue of guns, a contentious issue, an emotional issue, an issue of great moment to this country. The Majority Leader agreed with the minority that every single amendment on the floor would be subject to a 60-vote threshold. Those were the terms under which every aspect of the gun debate was debated. I would note that one amendment that was submitted during that gun debate was the Grassley-Cruz amendment. It was the law enforcement amendment that put real teeth in going after felons and fugitives who try to illegally buy guns. It put real teeth into forcing states to report mental health records so that we can prevent those with serious mental illnesses from illegally purchasing firearms. And I would note, Mr. President, that the Grassley-Cruz bill received a majority vote in this institution. A majority of senators voted for it, including 9 Democrats. It was the most comprehensive, it was the most bipartisan of the comprehensive gun legislation voted on in this body. And yet it did not pass into law because the Majority Leader set a 60-vote threshold for every amendment. I would suggest that Obamacare is no less important. Obamacare is no less controversial, and Obamacare likewise should be subject to the same threshold. If the Majority Leader believes Obamacare is good for America, if the Democrats in this body believe Obamacare is good for America, then I would encourage this body, let's debate. Not in the artificial sense in which we debate 1 or 2 senators talking to an empty hall, but in the real sense of making the case to each other and the American people about whether this law is working or whether it is not, because everywhere I travel in the state of Texas and across the country, Americans come to me and raise the single biggest challenge they're facing is Obamacare. It's killing their jobs. It's taking away their health care. It isn't working. Now, we all know that 3.5 years ago, Obamacare was forced into law on a strict party line vote by straight brute force. But it shouldn't be funded that way. That's not the way a government should proceed. That's not the way this institution should proceed. A 60-vote threshold does not require that the majority leader get a great many Republican votes, but it does require that he get a few, that he cannot simply do it with the votes of only the Democrats in this body. This country will be better off if we work together to restore economic growth and to stop the incredible job loss that is coming from Obamacare. In fact, regarding a 60-vote threshold, here's what the learned majority leader has had to say. Quote, "For more than 200 years, the rules of the Senate have protected the American people, and rightfully so. The need to muster 60 votes in order to terminate Senate debate naturally frustrates the majority and oftentimes the minority. I am sure it will frustrate me when I assume the office of Majority Leader in a few weeks. But I recognize this requirement as a tool that serves the long-term interest of the Senate and the American people and our country." I agree with Majority Leader Reid. I agree that 60-vote thresholds ensure that we behave not just on a partisan matter, but in a way that brings us together, and given the challenges coming from Obamacare, I believe nothing is hurting the American people more. Nothing is hurting the economy more. Nothing is damaging jobs more than Obamacare. Given the majority leader's objection raised today, the path that the majority intends to go is now clear. It is clear for Democrats, it is clear for Republicans, it is clear for the world to see. The majority leader has stated it is his intention to force a vote to fund Obamacare, and to do so using just 51 votes, to do so on what could be a straight party line vote, and in all likelihood would be a straight party line vote. Mr. President, I would suggest that is not a responsible course of action. And it's not a course of action that I think Republicans should acquiesce to. If it is the majority leader's intent to fund Obamacare using just 51 votes, then I would submit to every Republican in this body, it is our obligation to our constituents to do everything we can to prevent the majority leader from funding Obamacare with just 51 votes. Any member of this body that votes for cloture on this bill will be voting to allow the majority leader to fund Obamacare on 51 votes. I think that vote's a mistake. I think that vote disserves our constituents. I think that vote hurts the people of America. 232 members of the House of Representatives came together and said explicitly, do not fund Obamacare. I would note that included 2 Democrats who came together with their Republicans in a bipartisan manner to say, this law isn't working. Maybe we thought it would work, but the facts, the evidence have proven that it is not working. The Senate should do likewise. The House acted last week because the House listened to the American people. And, Mr. President, I would suggest that every member of this body should do exactly the same thing. Listen to the American people, because if we listen to the American people, we will, number one, keep the government running. I wish the majority leader had agreed to my request to take a government shutdown off the table by passing the House continuing resolution. If we listen to the American people, we will, number two, take any default on the debt off the table. I wish the majority leader had not objected to doing so right now. I wish the majority leader had not said he intends to continue to use the threat of a default to engage in brinksmanship to try to force Obamacare on the American people. And if we listen to the American people, we will recognize that this law is not working. That is why big corporations asked for and received an exception. That is why members of Congress asked for and received an exception. That is why unions have just recently come forward and asked for an exception. They have not yet been granted. But I'll venture a prediction now, which if Congress votes to continue funding Obamacare, that union exemption will not be far away. And then we will be left in a world where the burdens of Obamacare, the job-killing consequences of Obamacare, fall just on hardworking American families, not on big corporations, not on members of Congress, and in the near future, I predict not on union bosses, only on hardworking American families, on single moms, on young people, on people struggling to climb the economic ladder. Mr. President, I would suggest that's getting it exactly backwards. This body should not be granting special rules, special favors for the ruling class, for those with power and privilege. We should be fighting for those who are struggling, and those are the people that are getting hurt the most by Obamacare. I believe this week will be a critical week for the United States Senate, where every one of us, and I hope to see Republicans and Democrats stand together and to say, setting aside partisan differences, we have an obligation to the people of our states. And Obamacare isn't working. And so we're going to step forward and recognize the simple reality that it's the biggest job killer in this country, and we should not affirmatively fund it. Mr. President, I yield the floor. President.
Senator from Texas.
I would note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
And waiting for senators to come to the floor here in a quorum call on the Senate floor. And we just heard from Senator Cruz, and of course earlier today he was in negotiations with Majority Leader Harry Reid on whether they would be moving forward on the continuing resolution to fund the federal government through December 15th. That bill, of course, has attached to it a defunding of President Obama's health care law. And some tweets coming in from Senator Henrich of New Mexico says, is the Senate on cruise control? Let's hope not. Lots of New Mexicans will be hurt if Senator Ted Cruz and company shut down the government over Obamacare. Lindsey Graham of South Carolina writes, I'm hoping some Senate Democrats will side with all Senate Republicans to defund Obamacare. And Maryland Senator Ben Cardin says most Republicans understand that we are not going to repeal Obamacare. Just a couple of tweets coming in from lawmakers there. We're going to turn now to the debate in the House floor that happened right before the bill passed there on Friday, the bill passing 230 to 189. And we'll take a look at those comments while the Senate is in a quorum call.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I come to the floor in many ways as a mother concerned about the children of America, as a grandmother concerned about all of America's children, but as a mother who steps into this chamber to say, this place is a mess. Let's get our house in order. We are legislators. We have come here to do a job for the American people. And that job means we have to make the government run for the good of the people. We are not here to expand government, but we're not here to eliminate government. If the idea is to limit government, let's work together to do that. But what is brought to the floor today is without a doubt, a measure designed to shut down government. It could have no other intent. Its purpose is clear. And if our colleagues on the Republican side deny that, then they have no idea of the gravity of the situation, to quote the Music Man, of the trouble that is contained in this resolution today. It is a wolf in wolf's clothing. The underlying bill to shut down government, the CR, is reason enough to object to it, because that bill will cost at least 1 million jobs in the course of the next year. It will cost 1 million jobs. It will not only do that, it will cut our investments in the future, in education, in biomedical research. The National Institutes of Health has the biblical power to cure. Where there's scientific opportunity, we have a moral obligation to meet that scientific obligation with the resources, to respect the talent, the intellect, the God-given intellect of the science to cure. And what do we do in this bill? Say no. We cut that. Doing serious damage to science, to health, and not only that, to our competitiveness as a nation. It's a vote that guts those investments, and not only that, if the underlying bill were not bad enough, if there were not reason enough to say, no, are you kidding, no, then they cloak it in wolf's clothing in saying, in their view, that they're going to defund the Affordable Care Act. And you know what that's about? That's simply about putting their friends, the insurance companies, back in charge in medical decisions for your families. But it goes farther than that. If that were not bad enough, it slashes the strongly bipartisan children's health insurance program by 70%, effectively eliminating an initiative that provides much-needed health to millions of low-income children. I remind my colleagues that that bill passed the United States Senate in a bipartisan way with a veto-proof majority. A veto-proof majority. But that's not good enough for you. You've got to slash it by 70% to harm those children once again this week. It wreaks havoc on the health care for our seniors by disrupting provider payments for Medicare and Medicaid. Either you don't know what you are doing, or this is one of the most intentional acts of brutality that you have cooked up with stiff competition for that honor. It cuts billions of dollars, again I say, from the National Institutes of Health, delaying important research and denying medical breakthroughs for future generations. Democrats have a responsible proposal that balances, that reduces the deficit under the leadership of Chris Van Hollen, our ranking member on the Budget Committee. It reduces the deficit in a responsible way, ends the devastating across-the-board cuts of the sequester, and it makes investments in the future and keeps government open, as opposed to this bill intended to shut government down. Keeps government open and working for the American people. I know my colleague, Mr. Hoyer, has been very vocal on this subject, and he will quote some Republicans and what they have said about this. So don't take it from us. Take it from you, Mr. Chairman, that this bill, well, I'll leave Steny to have the exact quote, does not enable us to do the work of government. I urge a no vote on this continuing resolution. It's a terrible proposition for our families and our communities and our country. It's always time for us to work together to help ensure, not endanger, the economic security and prosperity of the American people. I urge my colleagues to vote no and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back, and the gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished Majority Leader of the House, Mr. Cantor of Virginia.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank the gentleman from Kentucky, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee in the House, for his leadership bringing this bill forward. Madam Speaker, I rise today in strong support of this measure, providing for the continuing resolution. Madam Speaker, today millions of Americans across this country are struggling. They're struggling to find good-paying jobs, and they're struggling to pay their bills. And their frustration with government continues to grow. These Americans, these hard-working middle-class Americans, are counting on their elected representatives to show leadership during these hard times. This continuing resolution will keep the government funded at its current level, without increasing spending on the discretionary level while Congress finishes working on a real budget. Americans are tired of seeing their government continue to spend more and more of their hard-earned tax dollars, and for the first time since the Korean War, it'll be possible to have 2 consecutive years of discretionary spending cuts. This resolution will also protect the working middle class from the devastating effects of Obamacare. Each week, we hear stories about how both major employers and small businesses are cutting back benefits and cutting back hours. The President's health care law is turning our full-time economy into a part-time economy. Even the heads of major unions, who were once so supportive of Obamacare, want to see this law drastically changed to avoid further, quote, nightmare scenarios, unquote. Let's defund this law now and protect the American people from the economic calamity that we know Obamacare will create. Americans back home are fighting for their families, and we in Congress were sent to Washington by our constituents to fight for them. They have put faith in their leaders to do what's right. For this entire Congress, the House has led on restoring faith in our economy and trust in our government. We should pass this continuing resolution so the Senate can finally begin to do the same. Again, I'd like to thank the gentleman from Kentucky, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Hal Rogers, for his work on this measure, along with the help of the gentleman from Louisiana, the Republican Study Committee, Chairman Steve Scalise, for their hard work on the issue, and I urge my colleagues to support this resolution.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
I am very pleased to yield 3 minutes to the distinguished whip, Mr. Steny Hoyer from Maryland.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Madam Speaker, today we are considering a measure to fund government only if the Democratic Senate and Democratic President will agree to dismantle the health care reform law that will help millions of Americans access quality, affordable care. That isn't going to happen, and it is a blatant act of hostage-taking. The Republican CR also lays the groundwork for a default on our debt, an unthinkable act, by instituting a pay China first provision. And it fully embraces the dangerous and irrational policy of sequester. This bill enshrines and confirms the descent into an economy-destroying, national security undermining, and ineffective rendering of the government that our country and our people need. The majority party, with its destructive obsession with the repeal of the Affordable Care Act and its unrestrained hostility towards government, has offered this bill notwithstanding Republicans' hollow claims of irrationality of the sequester policy their party adopts. The majority does so notwithstanding their chairman's accurate description of their policy of sequester, and I quote the distinguished chairman, Mr. Rogers, as, quote, unrealistic and ill-conceived. His words, not mine. A policy which Chairman Rogers himself says, and I quote again, must be brought to an end. His words, not mine. Chairman Rogers' vote today and the votes of his colleagues will, I expect, do just the opposite. They will vote to continue a policy that will inevitably lead to an American decline and retreat. I will not be party to the disinvestment in America's greatness. Today's bill undermines the education of our children, the security of our seniors, the present and future health of our people, the strength, training, and readiness of our armed forces, the growth of our economy and the creation of jobs, the quality and viability of our infrastructure, the health of our environment, the proper compensation and respect for those who labor in the public sector, and most certainly the honoring of America's debts and obligations. Today's bill undermines all those priorities and more. I will not support it, and I urge my colleagues to oppose it. And it continues us on the path so aptly described by Chairman Rogers, again, his words, not mine, as this lurching path from fiscal crisis to fiscal crisis. I urge my colleagues with wisdom and courage on your side of the aisle to oppose this bill. 30 additional seconds.
The gentleman's recognized for 30 additional seconds.
Madam Speaker, I am for a comprehensive, balanced, and responsible policy that will put this nation on a fiscally sustainable, stable path. I have been and continue to be willing to work with all of my colleagues to adopt such a bill. I take nothing off the table. I believe it will take both reason and political courage to achieve such an objective. Americans are hoping and, yes, praying that we will have such wisdom and such courage. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill and commit themselves to adopting a bipartisan and effective alternative to this destructive and irrational path.
The gentleman's
and I
time
yield
has
back the balance
expired.
of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Speaker, the minority whip is dead wrong. This measure protects the full faith and credit of the United States by assuring that our sovereign debt will be paid in full and on time. It is imperative that our creditors know that whatever battles rage in Congress, their loans to this government are absolutely secure. Our ability to pay all of our bills depends on our credit, and this resolution guarantees it. It also addresses two crucial fiscal concerns. I am getting frantic and heartbreaking calls from folks who've just received staggering increases in their health premiums, who've been notified their health plans being dropped or having their work hours cut back as a result of Obamacare. This stops that train wreck. And second, it's for limited duration. CRs abandon our fundamental responsibility to superintend the nation's finances. They should only be used as stopgap measures, and this bill does that. This resolution keeps the government open while meeting these vital tests. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Moran.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This vote is about more than these two throwaway provisions, which we know are not going to be taken seriously and should not by the Senate or by the country. But I'm going to oppose it for another reason, because I used to be very proud of this institution, used to be able to go through my community, and many of those who have served as long as I have know what it was like to be proud to be a member of Congress, to know that we had improved the lives of our constituents, that we had helped them build bridges and buildings and roads, that we could walk through the NIH campus, proud of what we had done for biomedical research, knowing we were improving lives, curing illnesses. We know what the government can do. This bill doesn't allow the government to do what it can to improve the lives of our people. We need to believe in this government again. We need to do what this Congress was meant to do. We need to fund the government adequately to be a first-class society and with a first-class economy that can compete and beat anyone. We can't do that on the cheap, and that's why we ought to vote against this. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the hardworking member of our Appropriations Committee, Mr. Nunley of Mississippi.
The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank the chairman for yielding, but more importantly for his leadership. The people sent me to Congress to help preserve liberty for future generations by limiting government and growing the economy. There's not a single law worse for individual liberty, for limited government or job creation than Obamacare. We must get rid of Obamacare and replace it with a system that provides choice, lower cost, and puts patients in charge of their health care decisions. Today, we're standing up for our principles, our constituents, and for Americans. We will pass this bill today out of the House, and I encourage my conservative colleagues in the U.S. Senate to take up this fight and stand with us to make sure we defund Obamacare. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to this distinguished gentlewoman from the District of Columbia.
Gentlewoman from the District of Columbia is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank my friend for yielding. All of us are trying to keep the government open, yet the federal government in the moment is engaged in contingency plans in case of a shutdown. So is the District of Columbia, because its budget is here. This local budget, this balanced $8 billion in local funds right here, because the Congress requires it to come and hasn't freed the D.C. budget. 3,000 hours and $131,000 is what it cost us in 2011 to prepare for a shutdown. When Speaker Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House, he worked with me to keep the District of Columbia open even as the federal government closed down. Because one thing is clear, the only thing worse than closing down the United States government is closing down an innocent bystander with not a dime in this fight, the capital city of the United States. Free the district. To free the budget of the District of Columbia. Don't close down the nation's capital.
Time has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Might I inquire, Madam Speaker, as to the time remaining?
The gentleman from Kentucky has 3 minutes remaining. The gentlewoman from New York has 2½ minutes remaining.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry.
Gentleman from Nebraska is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, the evidence is very clear that Obamacare is actually hurting people. In the last week, I've heard from several constituents like Mike, Jim, and Kathleen, who told me that they recently received their notice that they no longer have their insurance policy and must go into the exchange. And upon exploring that, found out that their policy in the exchange will cost anywhere from 50% to 100% more and have higher deductibles and co-pays. They're not sure of what plan they can go on. They're not sure what the totality of the benefits and cost will be. Kathleen is on a fixed income and is older, and she may have to have a policy with coverages that she doesn't want or need. I hear their heartbreaking stories like this from my constituents in the metropolitan Omaha area. These are just 3 real-life examples of how Obamacare is truly hurting people and squeezing them. I want the Senate to join us in acting on eliminating, defunding Obamacare. Let's start over in a real bipartisan way and really help folks get the health care they need.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, how much time do I have remaining?
The gentlewoman from New York has 2½ minutes remaining.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself the remaining time.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, the American people are counting on us to do our jobs, to work together, to create jobs, to keep the government open and to keep the economy running. This is not the time or the bill for relitigating health reform or for holding up the administration's ability to protect the full faith and credit of the United States of America. With the great suffering in the wake of another natural disaster in Colorado, and my heart goes out to all those families who've lost lives, who've lost loved ones, who've lost property. This is not the time, my friend, to limit the ability of the United States of America to give relief to those losing loved ones, homes, and livelihood. Republicans refuse to work together with the Senate and the White House to bring a constructive piece of legislation to this floor today. Instead, we consider a bill we know is destined for failure in the Senate and would be vetoed by the White House. For months, the majority has failed to lead. They have refused to appoint members to work with the Senate on a top-line spending number. They can't even pass their own spending bills in this chamber. And we remember how the very important Transportation and HUD bill had to be pulled off the floor because they couldn't find the votes. And today, they risk halting government services, functions vital to the American people and our economy, even when their own appropriations chairman, my friend Mr. Rogers, has said we should end the sequester, find a balanced plan forward just days before the end of the fiscal year. They're still playing political games. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill, support the responsible replacement of the sequester with a balanced plan to create jobs and keep our economy moving. I know we can do it, and I would be pleased to be part of that partnership with the chair, Mr. Rogers.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 2 remaining minutes.
I thank the Speaker. Madam Speaker, we are doing a CR, even though the Appropriations Committee on the House side passed 11 of the 12 bills through the committee, 4 of them across the floor of the House, and the remaining ones waiting for floor time as we've run out of time. Consequently, this continuing resolution will continue the government past the September 30 end of the fiscal year.
Speak to the Senate as if in morning business.
Without objection.
On September 11th, we came together as a country on the National Day of Service and Remembrance to honor those lives lost on that tragic day 12 years ago and celebrated the bravery and commitment of our men and women in uniform. As our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines continue to defend our freedom and security abroad, Americans back home have also been stepping forward to serve their communities and country. Last week brought the 20th anniversary of the signing of legislation that created AmeriCorps. With that occasion in mind, I rise to speak in honor of the men and women in civilian national service who have sacrificed their time and energy to serve our country by strengthening our communities. We honor them for their commitment and hold them as shining examples for rising generations. Over the last 2 decades, more than 820,000 AmeriCorps members have quietly and selflessly given, in total, more than 1 billion hours of service to our country. In Arizona alone, more than 15,000 residents have served more than 16 million hours and have earned Siegel AmeriCorps Education Awards totaling nearly $37 million. They have mentored and tutored school children, helping students stay on track with their education and have a chance at a better future. They have helped communities recover from devastating natural disasters, supported military families, and helped veterans overcome the stress of a decade of conflict and reintegrate back into civilian life. They worked in our national parks and on our public lands that preserve the story of America for future generations, and so much more. For their dedication and service, they receive a modest living allowance and an education award that can keep the dream of a college education within reach. They've also earned my respect and the admiration of citizens around the country. As we reflect on the dedication of those who have served, we must also ask ourselves, what more can we do to give more young Americans the opportunity to follow in their footsteps? As the Franklin Project at the Aspen Institute has called for, we should make a year of national service, whether military or civilian, a rite of passage for all young Americans. We should expand AmeriCorps service positions as we called for in the bipartisan Serve America Act that we passed nearly 5 years ago. We should strengthen partnerships with federal departments and agencies to use national service as a cost-effective strategy to meet their missions. And we should work with the private sector, from corporations and philanthropic organizations to higher education and faith-based institutions, to support the creation of service opportunities and to recognize the contributions of those who serve. We should also continue to remain engaged throughout the world by, among other things, fulfilling the promise of the Peace Corps. At its founding, America started with a grand notion, the recognition that all men are created equal and that they are endowed with certain inalienable rights that must be protected. But recognizing that there are those among us in common causes greater than our own self-interests that require our attention and care, the Declaration of Independence also emphasized we mutually pledge to one another our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Benjamin Franklin likewise talked about creating a republic if you can keep it, and created a corps in Philadelphia through which citizens could serve their community. John Adams likewise spoke of how the duty to serve our country ended, but with our lives. Throughout history, presidents from both parties put into place initiatives that put our people into productive service to our nation. Examples include Franklin Roosevelt's Civilian Conservation Corps, John Kennedy's Peace Corps, Lyndon Johnson's VISTA program, Richard Nixon's Senior Corps, George H.W. Bush's Points of Light, Bill Clinton's AmeriCorps, George W. Bush's Freedom Corps, and more recently the passage of the Serve America Act, which reauthorizes and expands national service programs. Today, Congress should step up. With so much division and discord throughout the country today, national service can help bring our country closer together. Drawing from lessons learned from the programs of the past, a renewed commitment to national service by this body can unleash the ingenuity of the American people and their desire to contribute to causes greater than themselves. It can channel the energy of the institutions of civil society, all, to get our country moving again. Think of it. Passionate, engaged young people from all backgrounds and regions across the nation tackling our toughest challenges in education, poverty, conservation, health, disaster response, reintegrating veterans, and more in a truly enduring way. In my view, nothing else binds us better and has us move forward as a nation more effectively than service to our nation, particularly service designed to improve lives and strengthen communities. For this reason, my vision for civilian national service is worth more than our aspirations. It deserves our commitment to achieving it. I thank you, Mr. President, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
I ask unanimous consent to suspend the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President. Mr. President, on Friday, a unified House Republican conference sent a strong message to the American people. Let's keep the government open, and let's protect the American people simultaneously from the harmful and potentially devastating effects of Obamacare. It's now time for the Senate to act. We know the President's health care law is not ready to implement. The Wall Street Journal recently reported that the government software that runs the online insurance marketplaces, known as exchanges, simply are not ready. They can't reliably determine how much people need to pay for coverage. Now, if in the face of this and the other aspects of the law that are not ready, many of them by the President's own admission, if the administration goes ahead with this law anyway, we know that Obamacare will be implemented in a manner that's manifestly unfair and it's likely to harm hardworking Americans. Big business, unions, and other special interests may well also receive special treatment under Obamacare, while the rest of the country will be forced into Obamacare's unfair, unworkable, and fundamentally unsound system. We know that the law is unaffordable. We know that it will be bad for the economy. At a time when we're running annual deficits approaching $1 trillion, Obamacare is going to cost roughly $2 trillion over the next 10 years. The law is forcing employers to shed workers, to cut back hours, and stop providing health insurance for employees. And we know that it's not going to work. The Congressional Budget Office recently concluded that after 10 years of Obamacare, 31 million Americans will still lack health insurance. We understand that these are inconvenient facts for the President and for members of this body who still support this law. But those are the facts, and we have a responsibility to do something about it. How many more people will have to lose their jobs, wages, and health care benefits before Congress acts? How many more states will have to announce that premiums are going up before we do something to protect the country? If the President won't act to protect the American people from this law and its harmful effects, Congress should. And so last Friday, a unified Republican House showed tremendous courage in enacting legislation, knowing full well what the media would say, what the President would say, and what Democrats on both sides of the Capitol would say. 228 Republicans responded to the will of the American people and overwhelmingly passed a bill that would fund government and protect the country from Obamacare. Only one party has voted to fund the government. Only one party has voted to avoid a government shutdown. And right now, the ball is in the Senate's court. Now, once the ball has reached the Senate, as has now happened, the Senate can respond in one of several ways. Basically, I see three options on the table, two of which are perfectly appropriate, one of which is unacceptable. The first option would be for this body, under the leadership of our Majority Leader, to take up a vote on this bill, the House-passed continuing resolution, the House-passed continuing resolution that keeps government funded but defunds Obamacare, and to give that an up or down vote, to vote on that bill as is without any modification. The second approach would be to open it up for an open amendment process, to allow us to debate and discuss and consider amendments on the House-passed bill, as each individual senator might deem appropriate for this body to consider. Both of these first two options are appropriate. Both of those first two options are understandable and acceptable under the totality of the circumstances. Some might naturally lean toward the first option, just moving quickly to consideration of the House-passed bill in as-is condition, given the fact that we are T-minus 7 days and just a few hours until the existing continuing resolution expires. On midnight, on the evening of next Monday night, we're just a little over 7 days before that continuing resolution expires. And so under those circumstances, many of us might suggest that the best option might be to take that first approach and for the Senate to open this up for a vote on the House-passed continuing resolution in as-is condition. But if this body doesn't want to do that, if it wants to amend the House-passed continuing resolution, it would still be appropriate for us to have an amendment process. But that needs to be an open amendment process, one that is appropriate for this body, a body that many have described as the world's greatest deliberative body. If, in fact, it is great and deliberative, if, in fact, we want to continue this tradition, then we need to have an open amendment process when amendments are considered. The third option that I referred to, the option that I would consider unacceptable, would be an option in which the Majority Leader would use a procedural trick to allow the Majority Party to gut the House-passed continuing resolution, removing its single most significant provision without allowing even consideration of one single additional amendment. This is not okay. So what I'm saying is we need to either pass the bill as is,
pass it or don't pass it, or we need to open up the amendment process so that all members of this body have the opportunity to introduce and vote on amendments as each individual senator deems appropriate. And those are the only two acceptable options. It would not be an acceptable option if the majority leader were to decide to use a procedural trick to allow only one amendment, an amendment that would gut the House-passed continuing resolution and effectively negate its single most distinguishing provision. Now, the question that leaves us with is that once this bill comes up in this body, will we, as United States Senators, be courageous? Will we do the right thing for the American people? Or will Senate Democrats threaten to shut down the government in order to protect an ill-conceived, unworkable, unaffordable, and fundamentally unfair law? There's no doubt that many voices will say that we can't win this fight, but I'm not so sure. 2 months ago, these same voices said that we could not and would not get this far. They said that this effort would amount to bad politics. They said that this simply would not work in the Congress as it exists in 2013. And they were wrong. They were wrong because what the House of Representatives passed on Friday is what the American people have been demanding. They've been demanding it overwhelmingly. They've demanded that Congress act to keep the government open and functioning while protecting the American people from the harmful, potentially devastating effects of Obamacare. And that's why I believe we can win. The Senate majority may have the upper hand, but the American people will and always must have the last word. Thank you, Mr. President. I note the absence of a quorum.